Have you ever heard a song and just wondered how the elements seem so cohesive, punchy, and professional sounding? That's all thanks to the power of one plugin. Compression. Compression is something that most beginning producers know about or have heard of, but fail to understand. Even just learning how to hear it can be hard, but today we're going to break down the mystery of compression by showing you how it works, how to hear it in your mix, and how to practice getting better at using it. That's actually not true. Mattie from the future here, and after starting the video edit, this whole video on compression turned out to be over 30 minutes of useful content and over 50 minutes of footage. So I decided to break it up into a mini series that's easier to digest. This first video will describe the basics of compression, and I'll cover the other parts I promised in the beginning, like how to hear it and techniques to better use it in separate videos. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss those. And back to the old Mattie to talk about compression. Before we dive deep into the world of squeezers and squashers, that's not an official term by the way, let's chat about dynamics. Have you ever been to a rock concert and then a quiet coffee shop gig right after? That contrast, my friends, between the blaring amps and the delicate acoustics, that's dynamics. It's the game of louds and softs. And in the studio, managing these dynamics is the difference between an amateur track and a professional banger. To help us keep our dynamics in check, we use compression. Imagine it as that friend who stops you from sending that 2 a.m. text or stops you from shouting out your undying love for pizza in the middle of a silent library. Compression is our ever-watchful guardian, ensuring our music doesn't get too loud or too soft, but maintains that sweet balance. It helps us hear every part in the song, from the quietest emotional whisper to the raging, distorted guitar solo. Compression can also affect the transience of a sound by altering the way we hear the initial burst of audio that comes from sounds. I'll explain that more when we talk about attack and release later on. Now let's take our understanding up a notch by getting visual with it. Do you see this? This roller coaster looking thing is our song's waveform. Peaks, valleys, the whole shebang. But what happens when we throw some compression into the mix? Here's that same file after it's been compressed. You can see that the biggest peaks and the deepest valleys are not as far away. That, my friends, is part of the magic of compression. Okay, gather around because now it's time for a crash course in Compression 101. To demonstrate this, I'm going to be using Logic's stock compressor. The first important thing to know about the compressor is the threshold. This is where it all begins. I like to visually think of threshold as this line here. Anytime that a waveform's amplitude goes above this line, the compressor will start. And that threshold is adjusted by adjusting the actual threshold here. The farther down my threshold goes, the farther down this line goes. If we're getting all of these transients here, we're going to have a very compressed sound. If we're just getting the tops and peaks, our sound will be less compressed. Next up, we have ratio. The ratio states how much we want to compress after we meet our threshold. If our threshold is right in the middle of this waveform here, that means every time our waveform goes over the threshold, we are going to turn it down by a mix of 3.5 to 1. Our ratio is set at 3.5 to 1. For every 1 decibel our waveform goes over the threshold, 3 decibels will be reduced from it. A common starting spot for compression is around 4 to 1. That's going to keep the sound sounding natural, but it's also going to give the compression effect we like. Next up, we have makeup gain. When we use compressors, we're often taking a lot of volume off of the main signal. To make up for that volume, some compressors, like this one, has an auto gain feature. Logic will automatically recognize how much is being taken away and add back in that much to the signal. I don't trust Logic's auto gain that much. I much prefer to use the makeup gain by myself. 99% of the time, I'm turning auto gain off and just using the makeup gain to taste. An easy way to do makeup gain yourself is just to make sure the input gain matches the output gain. Attack and release says how quickly this compressor is going to start working. If we have a slow attack time, something like 100 milliseconds or more, I'm just using this automation to visualize what's happening. Might be get here, but the compressor might not actually start compressing until about 20 seconds in. It might look something like this. This is 100 milliseconds afterwards, and then it starts compressing. Similarly, the release time is how much that compressor is going to activate after it leaves the threshold. So if my release time is long, that means I'm still going to compress here and it's going to gradually fade away back to what it was before. If my release time is short, that means it's going to quickly go back to the volume level it was before. Okay, now that we've got an idea of how compression works, let's explore what it sounds like by overcompressing our sound. Overcompression is when too much compression is applied to the signal. Too much compression takes away the energy, the body, and the life of a real performance. It can also cause pumping and distortion. Let me show you an overly compressed sound so you can hear what it sounds like with this new drummer track that I just loaded in. Now I loaded in a drummer track with a basic sounding beat so you can hear what this sounds like. I'm going to crank the threshold really, really low, and I'm going to crank the ratio at something like 8 to 1. I'm going to take this attack time and release time and just leave them as is. I'm looking for maybe negative 20 decibels of gain reduction. That's what this graph is showing, how much gain is actually being taken out. We'll take up the makeup gain so you can hear it. Do you hear the pumping that's happening? The instruments are working in between each other. When one plays, the other's duck out. When the kick drum plays and the snare drum plays, this hi-hats kind of pop their heads out for a second. It also has a big pumping effect for that reason. You can also hear distortion on this signal. Let's take a listen again. It sounds very overly processed and it sounds very unique. There are some songs that use this amount of compression on drums, but for my taste, it's a little bit too much. Now let's go into proper compression, or something I might actually use on a track. Let's take the compressor down a notch and dial it in for real. This may be subtle for you, but stick with me. I'll share some ways you can grow your ear to hear this subtle compression in a bit. Before, after. Listen to how those snares suddenly become longer. Listen to how the kick drum and the hi-hats all play together with each other so that they are suddenly become a little bit more groovy. When there's not a kick drum or a snare playing, those hi-hats are popping their heads in and out, like I mentioned earlier, but with less effect. Now, with proper compression, it leads to tighter sounds, enhanced quiet details, and better controlled transients. Alright, you've learned about compression. The ins, the outs, the ups, the downs, and all the knobs you can think of. You've also learned about what too much sounds like. And now that you understand compression a little better, take these tools and go forth and slay your beat-making dragons. If you're interested in seeing the rest of this mini-series on compression and find out how to actually hear it and 5 techniques for using it better, go ahead and hit the subscribe button so you don't miss it. The next video will be coming out within the coming 7 days, so you can look forward to watching it. And if it's past 7 days, you can watch it by clicking here. Happy beat making. I'll see you in the next one.